I built this Rhodes-ish piano in a previous video, and I've been absolutely loving it in the studio. It's felt right at home, it sounds wonderful, but I didn't get a chance to go much into the legs for this piece and how they came about. And really, to me, they're almost an equal highlight to the piano itself. The original Rhodes had these spindly metal legs. They did actually look kind of cool, but I wanted to reimagine the legs for this particular piece. A design that could be kind of light, that won't detract from the visuals of the piano itself, but still kind of musical and minimalist. And since I'm a furniture maker, these legs have to be made from a unique chunk of wood. You can't see it yet, but this piece of black walnut is among the most bizarre I've encountered in my shop. But this piece of wood comes with some difficulty. One of the biggest challenges I've faced as a woodworker, and even more broadly as a musician and designer, is when I've had total open-ended freedom. It's not been the limitations. When I'm working on music at the computer, for example, I often struggle to finish songs because there are endless plugins and possibilities that could be pulled into a session. For some reason, when it comes to limitation of space, I really enjoy coming up with solutions to those kinds of problems. Limitations should spark creativity, and working within boundaries can lead to a more focused and efficient solution. For this project, my limitation is about as black and white as it gets. I want to use this board, and it's kind of almost too small. So I do have a sketch in mind for this piano base, and I've broken each element down to see what I can get to fit within this single slab. I've got 4 vertical legs, 4 angled horizontal stretchers, and 1 center stretcher that's going to link both halves together. After laying out those elements, I quickly found that I can only fit 2 of these angled stretchers, not the 4 that I would need to create a balanced structure. I was so close though that I started considering using this remaining material in the negative space here to cut a bunch of veneers and kind of wrap those around another piece of wood for color consistency. But the more I stared at the negative space there, by the way, you should always be paying attention to the negative space while you're designing. And as I thought about the overall shape of the structure, I realized that I don't need those to be equal lengths. I can shorten the 2 rear stretchers and create kind of an offset because I'll only be seated at one side of the piano. So I used that entire area of negative space to define my new length, and I can see exactly where the grains are going to wrap across each piece. This is going to pull those rear legs in a little bit, which has the added bonus of highlighting this amazing wood figure and make each leg fully visible when facing the piano. And because I have to make things more difficult for myself, I'm also going to add a slight horizon line to span across the bottom of this structure. It's one of those details that I love as a designer but hate as a builder, but I'm compelled to do it. So it's there. I'm going to talk about this scaled miniature in a little bit and use it to illustrate some of the build process along the way, but first I'll get set up over in the workshop to get our walnut pieces cut. I'm setting my exact layout over to the CNC to make my initial outlines. I'm only cutting the profile of each element, and then I'm going to free those pieces on the bandsaw. This could also be done by cutting out templates and taping them onto the material to just follow at the bandsaw and the router, but I decided to risk it on the CNC since I wasn't cutting all the way through anyways. So with each of those freed on the bandsaw, I can trace that profile now with a flush trim bit, which just rides along the outline that we just cut on the CNC. I'm going to take extra care at the end grain down here. It's not only prone to tear out, but this can also be a dangerous cut as the piece kind of wants to just be ripped out of your hands. The joints are going to align like this, but they're not perfect right off the router. So I'm going to feel for any ledges or bumps in each surface there and carefully take many small passes on each face with a low angle plane until I end up with a perfectly square, flush connection between the two. Once those joints have no gaps along the seam, I need to reinforce that structural bond with some tenons. And in this instance, I'll be using some dominoes to accomplish that. And I'm occasionally very unscientific about it. Here I'm just sighting a position that looks right, and then I will mark a line for each domino where both pieces will come together. They really need a shared component inside them like this to safely distribute the weight and tension the joints may experience over their lifetime. But I'm really into the plan for this structure. As I can tell, it's easily going to support many times its own weight and still have the sleek and thin overall look that I was going for. So I'll set 3 dominoes per joint, and I do have grain preferences for the front and rear legs, so I'm going to keep track of which pieces are paired, and that's just an aesthetic choice. I want to get these first 4 joints completed so I can treat each leg and stretcher as one single unit, and further shape and thickness them all together from there. Fortunately, this stage of the glue up is not very difficult. If you noticed that little notch in my stretchers, that is going to help with the clamping process down the line. It will eventually be cut off once I'm done with that later stage in the glue up, but for now it's an important detail to preserve. Once I know that I can control the clamps and I'm happy with the placement of these tenons, the weight distribution of this design all sort of leans inward toward the center. So it's going to make for a very strong framework where the pressure is balanced and encouraged all the way to the floor. For now though, it's one leg at a time, and I will have some daunting, intricate work ahead of me. You can see the clamps connecting well with those notches in the wood, which gives me the controlled pressure that I need for this glue joint. And a quick look at the glue seam, I can see it's fully seated in there. I should end up with a nearly invisible glue line once this is all dried. I'm going to leave these for a few hours and go put on an extremely fancy outfit to go to dinner with my wife.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you recognize me, but I built this piano on YouTube.
When we returned, she encouraged me to go to the shop and check on them. They're not ready for any stress in the joints just yet. They'll need a full 24 hours for that, but I'm really happy with the seams and this assembly so far, and I know I'll be set up well for the real work ahead. The first step of which is cutting this 45-degree angle to begin the joint, where each leg assembly meets. These are called 1, 2, 3 blocks. They are 1 inch by 2 by 3, and they have a nice weight to them. I needed 1 inch of spacing on center for these next dominoes, but the odd angles of the legs make it difficult to mark a position. So I'm going to use one of these 1, 2, 3 blocks to help not only locate the domino placement, but they acted as a 90-degree reference surface so I know both legs are balanced. And with those holes placed, I can knock off those clamping tabs finally while the legs still fit on the bandsaw. I was moving pretty well through this build until I had a problem in this moment, which caused me to give up on my old method of clamping these types of joints. I used to glue on a temporary triangular piece of wood to the outer edge where the clamp can engage, but let's bring you up to speed on what's really involved with this joint. I 3D printed each element in a scaled miniature to kind of have as a dry run to identify any weak points in the design. With a scaled miniature, I can very quickly eyeball the assembly, sand my pieces down, glue them in an instant with CA glue and an accelerator spray, and get my pieces attached without worrying about mistakes because I can just print some more if I need to. The CA glue sets, and these are what I want the leg segments to look like after this 45-degree glue up. You can see the offset there. But later I'll need to square off that little triangle to meet perfectly with the thickness of the middle stretcher. So I'm doing a little dry run for that, and when the baby beetle shows up, I will extract that from the scene with an X-Acto knife. And I'm just gonna place that off to the side here, making sure not to stick it on its back. Yeah, not on the... And then I can resume and focus on the rest of the sanding. So I had mentioned I abandoned the previous method of clamping those 45s with a triangular wood piece. The problem is that when I went to clamp the first joint, my clamping piece tore out of the wood while I was tightening the clamps, which damaged some of the actual leg stretcher, and I had to back out of that glue up entirely. But this led to me sitting down and finally designing the exact clamping calls I've always needed for these kinds of joints anyways. When they're printed on their side, the filament has the right grain direction, for lack of a better word, to keep a lot of strength in those tab sections and not fracture apart the way that a wood version might. They are meant to work with quick clamps, F-style clamps, spring clamps, and I'm going to go one step further and add strips of adhesive-backed corkboard to the bottom of these clamping jigs. This will provide a padded and grippy surface that will protect my workpiece without marring the surface of even soft woods, and of course prevent the clamps from migrating once there's pressure added during the actual glue up. I printed a bunch of them in different sizes and I'm ready to put them to use. Since this footage was shot, I've been using these clamps for months on other builds and they're holding up perfectly. So I'm going to actually make these files available if you'd like to print your own, and maybe I'll do a small run of printed sets myself with the corkboard strips. One thing I like to avoid is leaving any gaps in a glue seam, and these joints came together extremely well, so it was well worth that little detour to make the clamping jigs. My real-life workpiece matches the miniature, and now I just need to shape both leg sections to identical specs. Underneath this piano, there needs to be a comfortable amount of leg room. I don't want to be kicking into the wood frame while I'm playing, and the offset that's created by having one long stretcher against a short one is it actually nudges that middle stretcher further back out of the leg zone. I'm 6'5", and I spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about the usability and comfort of a piece I'm designing. This goes for the product line in my business, like my desks and sidecars, as well as one-off projects like this Rhodes project. And because the rest of the build needs to be precise, I will take a moment to prep my chisel and hand plane blades. They need to be perfectly sharp and reliable so the remaining joinery and shaping is exact. The water here just floats off the minuscule bits of particles being ground off the blade. And I'm going to work my way from 300 up to 14,000 grit, looking for a razor edge all the way across the blade. The first duty of the chisels is pretty easy, and that's just to clean up the inside corner of these joints. They will eventually get a small triangle block glued in at this corner, and there's some dried glue in there that just has to go. And this is a glimpse of the damage left over from that clamping incident. Fortunately, a lot of the damage exists in a cutoff zone, so I happened to get lucky there. Before I cut this at the table saw, I'm going to pre-sever the wood fibers along the cut line. I'm wrapping the scoring line around with my machinist square by following the notch with my blade, and then snugging the square up to the blade, so I know that I'm following the line exactly all the way around. This is also going to prevent any crazy tear out that could be caused by my table saw blade. I made a quick sled to ride along the miter slot in the table, with the legs just being secured to the sled with double-sided tape, and I cut almost to my score line. I'll finish the rest of that segment with a hand plane. And I'm gradually making my way up to the score line there. I'll check for a square to make sure I'm not introducing too much preference to one side or the other. The next glue up is pretty major, so now is a good time to take care of any difficult elements while these pieces can still fit on the machines. The little horizon line detail that I baked into this design has made it so I only ever had one flat reference surface for every one of these joinery cuts. It's required organization and planning to prevent mistakes along the way, and I think in this case it's probably debatable whether it was a significant enough design enhancement to have put there in the first place, but it's too late now. Making scaled miniatures of my work over the years has been so effective for finding that final clarity when you're iterating a design. Being able to physically view something from all angles before ever cutting the first slab, looking for any bulky or extraneous elements in a design that maybe looked fine on screen but in the real world just don't quite feel right. More importantly, getting to test out different joinery approaches or refine structural elements in a design in this way has really enhanced my workflow and improved my work in general. I often make miniatures out of either 3 or 6mm plywood because at scale it approximates the flex and weight distribution of its larger cousin, the furniture grade plywood that I often work with. but it's actually a lot of work to make those wooden miniatures. And more, I've been delving into 3D printing for some of that prototyping stage. The filament I used for these piano legs is a wood-based PLA. Supposedly it can be stained, although I've never tested that, but it does sand and shape a little bit more like wood. I also use these printers to make some accessories to products in my furniture business, which are the extra little details that kind of button up a product. And I eventually found myself making a complete model of the piano I designed in that last video. And it came out pretty well. Each piece clicks into place after a little sanding and cleanup, and then can be held in with some CA glue. I enjoyed working at this micro level, so if you're interested in printing a kit of your own, I'll also make these STL files available, and I will have some printed kits available for purchase and assembly as well. Anyways, I'm considering making a video covering the scaling process, both with wood and 3D printing, but I honestly don't know if this is one of those things that only I am interested in bothering with. So if you'd want to see that, or you have a specific question you'd like covered in a video like that, please just let me know in a comment and I'll keep track of the responses. Back in the real world, I am making the final preparations for the leg joints for what is going to be a significant glue up, and I was nervous about it. This is the important stage where the entire piece really comes together, and I don't want the frame to wobble, so I'm just gluing it all at once where the feet can use my workbench to register evenly. I'm about to use way too much glue here. There is excessive squeeze out, and I didn't use a glue with a longer open time, so I'm against the clock a bit. But in this case, the excessive glue may be helpful. If I were being light and conservative with it, the glue would definitely begin to flash or be absorbed by the end grain before the joint is fully in place. But with this much glue, it kind of insulates itself a little longer. It just creates a little more mess. The whole thing took a while, and I'm kind of surprised that I don't look super panicked in this moment, because watching the footage back, I could see in real time how long I was letting the glue sit there before I began to put any pressure into the joints. I was having to determine in the moment where the pressure was best directed, and had to grab these mahogany triangles I had sitting around to accompany the parallel clamps and keep everything controlled. I will say, over the past couple years, I have chosen to be a little more kind to myself in all facets of my life. It has definitely had a real effect on me, and weirdly, watching this portion of footage back was a confirmation for me that I have significantly shifted my headspace. Because I can see that I'm frustrated, but staying measured, and I've found that mentally zooming out a little bit to appreciate all the years of learning and work that I've put in just to get to a project like this is helpful. That would have been a good time to go apeshit in this footage and smash some of my tools, but I didn't do that. Some people got really angry that I built this piano for myself.
It's freaking awesome, dude.
Anyways, I've got some pieces coming together for an upcoming project, if I can figure out all the mechanics. Using old piano parts, playing with the dissonance between a bunch of vintage bells that I've been collecting for years, controlled by a keyboard. I don't know what direction that project will take just yet, but I'm telling you now, it won't be a bunch of cheap plastic shit inside the casket. The joints need a little cosmetic cleanup now, mostly from the glue and just some minor discrepancies where one surface meets the other. And Sean gave it an initial sanding pass before I get to adding a round over throughout the entire piece, wherever I can fit the trim router at least. I had some comments in the last video calling me out for not naming my assistant, which is fair. And I had a whole plan to just tease a build up to his name over the next few videos, but unfortunately I just learned he's going to be stepping away in a couple months. So there will be a bit of an adjustment period coming up for the Munster shop and hiring someone new, where I'll hopefully still be deciphering phrases like,
You got a 300-year-old something for me?
Sean has been a great assistant over the years for many, many builds as my business has grown. But fortunately, Rhode Island is a tiny state, so we will keep tabs on him, and he'll definitely keep tabs on us. Time to figure out how I'm going to attach these legs. I didn't like the idea of them directly interfacing with the bottom of the piano. It's too much focus pressure, and I'd worry about a fracture or something if I were ever to just drag this piano without care, which I won't ever do, but I want to spread the weight distribution at the belly of the piano. So I came up with these weird elements. What you're seeing is actually upside down of what its final orientation will be, but those protrusions will meet with the upper end of each individual leg. This will control any flex from the legs and will also share and spread the weight out from the belly of the piano. There's a superficial crack on one of these supports that I'll just do a quick epoxy fill on and hand them back over to Sean to clean up. This walnut is unfortunately not from the primary slab that the legs are made from, so there's going to be a bit of a color difference. So we're going to chamfer the mating edges. Rather than try to disguise that transition between these elements, which you'd never win, honestly, you'd typically want to break the eye line a bit with maybe a brass line, a contrasting species, or in this case, just a simple chamfer. The color will be close enough, and these support pieces are going to be kind of buried under the piano anyways. There's going to be some weird joinery ahead for these support pieces, but right now it's actually not a bad time to just get some oil on everything before I get into all that. I had some questions about the finishing process on the piano, which I didn't really detail. For this piece, I'm just going with a couple coats of Danish oil, which is thinned a bit further than directly from the can. There are so many finishing options out there, and there's endless advice on YouTube. I like the simplicity of starting with the Danish oil. It penetrates, the oil brings out the depth of color in the wood. It has a little bit of varnish in it, which basically gives a foundation for the top coats to bite into once you're at that stage. Why overthink these things? I'm going to add a physical Munster brand instead of a stamp, and for special one-of-a-kind pieces, I go with brass against the walnut. The inlaid pocket is definitely enough to hold the branding, but a little bit of CA glue will just keep it there from now on. With the oils dried, I can stage out the interlocking joinery for these parts. I'll explain my approach through each step, but the basic plan is to have a floating dowel connecting the supports to the legs, and then next to the dowels I'll have a hidden furniture bolt. So I'm drilling a location for the dowels first. With those holes perfectly vertical, I can use them as a reference point to pair with the legs and continue that hole downward. I'll set one leg up first, lock that in place with a dowel, and then drill the second hole, knowing I now have a perfect relationship between each connection. I want to use the floating dowels because they'll bear so much of the tension between those joints. It really links them together in addition to the bolts that are coming. The holes are not quite deep enough yet, but I don't want to chew up the walnut too much because the dowels need to be tight there. So I made a basic guide jig to complete the hole. It rests on both legs and just lets me complete that task without marring up the walnut supports. To hide the furniture bolts, I'm going to Forstner out a spot for the head of the bolt to sink into. These are okay to fully drill out here. So I placed my dowels and then drilled holes for the furniture bolts to thread into. The bolt is going to screw directly into the wood, so I set that up with a tap thread, although I really could have just used the bolt itself to cut the threads. I think I just had the tap out already. For a top coat, this is a satin lacquer. It's my preferred sheen on basically everything and seems to pair well with the Danish oil undercoat. The dowels are a snug fit, so I'm just going to tap them into place for what may be the last time ever in the life of this piece. You'll hear how strong the bolt to wood connection is as the threads engage here. This finishing stage took place prior to the install of those supports, and again, I'm going with the satin lacquer top coat here. I ended up with 4 or 5 coats total. And then because I can't leave well enough alone, I'm going to inset some rubber feet rather than just install them flat against a wood. I'm using a tool here that is so helpful for these occasional weird duties, so I'm comfortable saying it's worth it to have in your shop. I used this portable drill press to place the holes in the pitch wheels for this piano, and it was the perfect odd tool to accomplish that. I'm using it here because I need to control the plunge depth of the Forstner bit where the rubber feet will sit. It's not possible to freehand a hole like that without all the legs being completely unbalanced to each other. This is the only shot I have of the piano going in place. I was about halfway done with the piano itself, but the shot gives a good idea of the stability in the legs. The only movement is because this lower table is on casters. I'll slowly drag that up to center, being careful not to block the cable pass-throughs, and then each side gets 3 bolts and nuts for a strong, impermanent connection in case I need to take this apart in the future. That original slab could have been used for a few things. It could have been a small tabletop in an entryway against a wall. It could have been sliced into veneers for book-matched doors for maybe a vanity. But using the full thickness here across such a wireframe design allowed the figuring in this piece to be viewed and appreciated from all angles. And I took the same approach with the piano itself, using the best scraps of wood I've saved from the waste bin and getting to enjoy them in a nice functional piece that will last for however long these electronics last, I guess. Is there room on the bench that I can sit there?
I can make room.
Alright, let's try a different sound. What the heck? What the